Welcome to the Make a Mental Note podcast, where mental health professionals share information and perspectives that illuminate, educate, and is worthy of a mental note. And now your host, Quarto.
Hi, everyone. Welcome again to the Make a Mental Note podcast. This is Quarto. I am enjoying some nice weather, finally, in Tennessee. We had some snow last week, but it's getting up to the 50s and 60s this weekend, so I really appreciate the nice weather. Well, the mental health tip for today is letting go and letting God. Have you ever heard of that saying? It's used a lot in addiction recovery, and the idea is to let go of things we can't control and hand them over to God, or to whatever we believe to be a higher power. Now think of a graduate student who's nearing the end of his graduate program. He's obsessing and worrying about the big comprehensive exam that he has to take and pass in order to earn his degree. It's just eating him alive, and he feels like he'll never have enough time to study, or that the exam will be too hard and he won't earn his degree that he's worked so hard for over the past couple of years. Well, letting go and letting God requires some action on his part. He needs to do his part, which is, preparing as much as he can for the exam, but then handing over his worries to God or his higher power. It's sort of like a father offering to carry his daughter's backpack when it's obvious that the child is exhausted from their day-long hike in the hills. It would be nice to have someone relieve her burdens, but the girl has to be willing to take him up on his offer. Well, the same thing applies to the graduate student. Worrying isn't going to help the guy do better on the exam. He has to be willing to hand over his backpack. Things will work out the way that they're supposed to work out. Yeah, I know, it's easier said than done, but the less we try to be in control of every single thing that happens in our lives, and the more faith we place in ourselves, as long as we do our parts, and our higher power, the less we'll fret and worry about things. So that's my mental health tip for today. All right, let's get to our podcast interview with Courtney Grimes. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Make a Mental Note podcast. Today, I'm joined by Courtney Grimes, who is the clinical director of the Eating Disorders Coalition of Tennessee and a psychotherapist at Symmetry Counseling Services in Nashville, which is a private practice. And Courtney, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, if you wouldn't mind, tell the mental note-taking audience a little bit about who you are and what you do for a living.
Sure. My name is Courtney. I'm in Nashville, Tennessee. I am the clinical director for the Eating Disorders Coalition of Tennessee, which is a nonprofit organization aimed to raise awareness in the community about eating disorder prevention and treatment. And the bulk of my job there is to help connect individuals with appropriate resources for various levels of care, and to kind of help set up treatment teams for eating disorders.
Okay.
I'm also in private practice at Symmetry Counseling, also in Nashville, and I'm a psychotherapist there. I do direct clinical practice, and a specialty is eating disorder treatment, obviously, and I work with a lot of anxiety and depression issues, and do some couples marriage counseling as well.
So you sound like you're one busy person.
I am one busy person.
Well, tell us a little bit about what got you interested in the field of counseling in general, and then eating disorders specifically.
Sure, great question. Let's see. I have been in Nashville. I'm from Atlanta originally, and I have been in Nashville for almost about 20 years.
All right.
And my first career in Nashville was in the music business, and did that for maybe 8 to 10 years before deciding to move into a second career path. What spawned me to sort of gain interest in psychology and psychotherapy was how many people I found just day to day were kind of silently suffering.
Yes.
People who are very high-functioning folks who were very image-driven and wanted to appear like they had it all together, but when they went home at night, were in a pretty decent amount of pain.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw how that affected individuals. I saw how that affected job performance. I saw how that affected families, and really sort of got a heart for helping. And I went into eating disorder counseling specifically because of my own recovery from an eating disorder. When I was in college and in my early 20s, I suffered from a pretty horrible eating disorder.
Okay.
And recovery on the other side of that is so profound and so amazing that I wanted to spend the rest of my life trying to go back into that kind of hole and try to pull other people out of it.
That's
and get
fantastic.
them back at participating in their lives again.
It's almost a form of giving back, isn't it? From
100%.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, 100%.
It's so interesting, Courtney, to listen to your story because it's similar to other people who I've interviewed on the podcast where they've had backgrounds or experiences, personal experiences that played a major role in what they have done and what they specialize in as a psychotherapist. And it sounds like that's the case for you.
Absolutely. And I think that's very true. And I remember thinking when I first started in this field, thinking, I don't know if this is going to help or hurt that I've been through a lot of these experiences, but ultimately I think it can only provide an additional sort of level of empathy with clients that I work with, because I truly know exactly how they feel.
Oh, right.
I'll be working with some of these folks and they're describing something, and in my head I'm thinking, oh my God, I totally remember that. I know exactly how that feels.
Yeah. So it's like, from a client's perspective, I think they listen to you and they think about you. She's been there. She's done that. She understands me. And I think there is something special about that. You had mentioned a few minutes ago that a lot of these people are image driven. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. The industry, the entertainment industry as a whole, obviously is very image driven. And so a lot of people make money off of fantasies that they sell to the general public. And part of the fantasy is to look a certain way, be a certain weight. Photos are all photoshopped. Music videos are all edited to portray people as their sort of onstage persona. And so a lot of folks, myself included, who enter into that world without really being educated as to what was happening, started to believe a lot of this was truth instead of entertainment and fantasy. And so then the idea is, well, I mean, to fit in here or to feel okay about myself, I need to look like this, and I should be able to present myself as what these folks do, and that can really lead into a lot of anxiety and depression. And I saw a lot of folks sort of take the next step into drug addiction and alcoholism. Mine went into an eating disorder, ways to manage that anxiety and depression, and you start to feel really bad about yourself, things like that. So for me personally, it acted kind of as a spiral downward.
I see. It's interesting. Yeah, you look at the media, and even and you've probably heard this too. If you look at the Barbie doll, if you were to blow the Barbie doll up to life size, what is it? Her chest would be like 42, her waist would be like 15. I mean, it's just, isn't that amazing?
Her head is too big for her body.
Yeah.
She would have toppled over, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Exactly. It's just amazing. So it really starts from a young age where we're given these messages, and I'm not sure if it's only messages toward females in particular. I want to ask you about that in a second, but it certainly starts at a young age. But do you find that with these media messages, Courtney, that it's primarily directed toward females, or is it starting to go toward males as well? How about that?
That's a really great question. I think that historically, image issues, body image issues, things like that, especially as we're marketed in the media, have historically been described as kind of female problems, women's issues, things like that. I couldn't disagree more.
All right.
I think while women seem to be more open about this, be more consumed with it, it absolutely affects men. There is a male, quote unquote, ideal image and there is a female, quote unquote, ideal image, and both are marketed to heavily. All humans are vulnerable in that capacity, men and women. All of us are vulnerable to that, I think, especially in this country. So my observation, especially with marketing in the media, is that it's absolutely geared towards women and men, and it is starting, you're right, at a younger and younger age.
Mm-hmm. I imagine that that there's a lot of shame that's involved in this particular disorder, as there are for other types of disorders, addictions, whatever the case may be. And I wonder if for men who have an eating disorder, if the shame is more intense for them than it would be for women, or not necessarily.
Well, I haven't experienced the shame surrounding eating disorders being more intense for my male clients versus my female clients.
Okay.
But I can only assume that if globally we look at things like eating disorders as being a quote-unquote female issue,
right,
then the likelihood of men coming forward and asking for help and admitting that they've got issues with food or exercise or body image, or it's going to be tougher for them to do that, because they don't want to be seen as, well, I'm this big, strong dude, but I have this girl problem, that kind of thing. So
yeah.
I can absolutely see how that would cause some pretty serious issues and barrier. The shame would be
Right.
that being a barrier between a male asking for help.
Yeah, and I guess that's what I was getting at, is because I think traditionally this has been thought of as a female disorder, but perhaps because of that, the men are just, they don't want to seek the help, or are less likely to seek the help because of the shame involved in that. I can remember many years ago when I did an internship in a psychiatric hospital, we had an eating disorders group, and there was only one male in that group therapy session. So I know that this is, predominantly, at least it has been over the years, female, but yet there could be many males out there who are suffering from this, who just don't want to either admit that this is an issue or want to seek the help because of the shame.
Agreed, completely agreed. And one of my larger fears as well is that when males do struggle with eating disorders and eating disorder behaviors, it doesn't cross their mind that that's what it could be.
Right.
Does that make sense? Because it is
Yes.
so tied to female issues, and that's even more concerning to me, is that there could be and potential arguably millions of men who suffer from this exact same mental illness that women do, but it doesn't occur to them that that's what it could be because
Right.
they are female.
Sure,
Right.
exactly. That's a really good point. So is there anything that the Eating Disorders Coalition of Tennessee does, like education-wise or information-wise, to reach out to men in particular, or is it just more of a general type of approach that you use? How is that done?
Most of our education and advocacy is general.
Okay.
We don't necessarily market our services towards women or men,
All right.
or a specific age group. We try to market to all ages because eating disorders really don't discriminate between gender or socioeconomic bracket or race or anything else. So we try to keep it as open and broad and approachable
Right.
as we possibly can. One struggle I've run into, however, with my work, referral work, is finding places in the country, treatment centers, who accept men. Most of the centers are female only, so there are only a couple of places that will be co-ed, that will treat both men and women.
I see.
Fortunately, they are absolutely fantastic, top-notch treatment centers that do that. But I and that's a struggle for me, because I'm not sure which comes first, the chicken or the egg. Do we start to offer more services for men,
Right.
and then more men can approach, or do we need more men to sort of speak out and prove the need for treatment, and therefore treatment services will increase? I'm not really sure.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, do you find that there are common themes or stories that underlie clients' problems, clients who have eating disorders, Courtney?
Sure, absolutely. I would say probably the most common issue among folks who struggle with eating disorders is safety. They don't feel safe. Something's happening. They don't feel secure. So a lack of security or a lack of kind of a core safety, typically for humans, lends to a sense of control. We need to start controlling things. That's what's going to make us feel safe,
I see.
right? So most of life, most of what happens in this world is really out of our control. So the more out of control we feel, the less and less safe we're going to feel. So a lot of times your psyche, your schema offers you this one beautiful little package that you can control. You can control what it does. You can control what you feed it. You can control how you treat it, and nobody else can touch it. Nobody else can make those calls. So sometimes that will show up, oftentimes actually, that will show up through an eating disorder. An eating disorder can show up as this beautiful little way to sort of control your body or control this container that you live in when everything else feels out of control. And so sometimes that will offer some folks a false, albeit, but an underlying sense of safety. I feel safe. I feel in control. I feel like I've got stuff together, if that makes sense. So that's kind of an underlying theme often.
Yeah, and I've often heard for eating disorders clients that control seems to be a very big theme. I've never heard of it related to the issue of safety and security, which is interesting to me. Where do you think that problem or that issue comes from, Courtney? The fact that some people may not feel safe or secure. I mean, where does that come from?
That's a really great question. I'm not entirely convinced it always comes from the same place. A lot of times people will establish really dysfunctional attachment patterns, in their infancy. So a lot of times people grow up with anxious parents, or they develop anxious or avoidant kind of attachment patterns, and that can breed a sense of not being safe. Sometimes it can be an environmental trigger, like you're bullied at school, or your parents get divorced, or you go through a really bad breakup. It can happen later on in childhood. It can happen in adolescence, and even in adulthood. We're finding there is a huge surge in eating disorders among middle-aged women who are going through the transition of empty nest. A lot of times they are entering into kind of like a single life after the death of a spouse or divorce. Eating disorders are very typical with transition of any kind. So I think that feeling out of control naturally comes with a transition, right? So a lot of these big-time transitions can trigger feelings of inadequacy, not being safe. I don't know what's going to happen next. I don't know if I can handle it. Things like that. And then we'll see a lot of folks kind of start clamping down and locking down and controlling their body and their food.
So the issue of control really is to help them regain a sense of security or a feeling of safety. And for eating disorders clients, that's done through controlling food intake or I guess behaviors around food. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And what we'll see too is a lot of times exercising is going hand in hand with that. There's an addictive exercise piece that oftentimes accompanies other eating disorder behaviors. So the feeling of control can come in with a certain amount of time spent in a gym rigidly, or a certain amount of mileage run every day, or a certain amount of sort of work that you put your body through. And we use all kinds of quantitative tools to try to measure that. But ultimately, it's the quantitative piece that's that's showing up to sort of give us this false sense of control.
So there, in some ways, there's a similarity between the patterns of eating disorder folks and people with addictions, because what they have in common is a compulsion, isn't it?
Yes, oftentimes you'll see that. Eating disorders are mental illnesses, and they're classified as process addictions.
Uh-huh.
Now, process addictions are different from chemical dependencies, like a drug addiction or an alcoholic.
Okay.
If I were to treat a chemical dependency, I can 12-step them. I could preach abstinence. For instance, if you never touch this substance again, you're probably going to be better off, right? But eating disorders are process addictions, which means that these folks have developed sort of an addictive relationship with their substance of choice, which is food.
Okay.
So we got to have food to live. They have chosen the very sustenance that we stay alive with to create these dysfunctional patterns. So what I've got to do is sort of go in and rewire their relationship with their substance instead of removing it from their life.
Yeah, sure.
So it's very similar addictive tendencies in terms of the compulsion and the obsession. I'll see a lot of that. These compulsive behaviors, they don't want to do what they do. I didn't want to do what I did, but it really felt like I was going to die if I didn't.
Right.
So the compulsive piece is absolutely there. But the tricky part is learning how to continue to engage with the substance, but sort of drain the compulsive piece out of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's got to be very challenging, especially when people are first coming into therapy and you perhaps talk to them about what treatment is going to look like, and they probably look at you and say, "What? What do I have to do?"
I know. I'm like, "Oh, please come back. Please come back."
Oh, well, and I've heard that, and I've heard some people who struggle with addiction characterize their substance of choice as their best friend, and it's almost like going through a breakup with a best friend, when they're having to give this up. And it's a very traumatic experience for some people. And I guess I want to ask you a little bit about that with eating disorders clients. I'm sure that they experience a lot of different feelings throughout the course of counseling and the whole change process. What are some of those feelings that they're struggling with, Courtney?
Well, first, I'm so happy that you brought that up, feeling like a breakup. That's exactly what it feels like. That is exactly what it feels like. And it's with a provider, you're breaking up with a protector, you're breaking up with a best friend.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, eating disorder treatment is geared towards demonizing the eating disorder, trying to fight it or get rid of it. But a lot of times I'll have my clients write letters of gratitude towards their eating disorder, write them a breakup letter. I love you. Thank you for keeping me safe. I know how to do that on my own now, so it's time for us to move on. Yeah, so a lot of times I'll have them write those gratitude letters because some of us don't hate our eating disorders. Some of us really love them and don't want to give them up. And it's very traumatic. It's like a death when we go through the grieving process. When we have to break up with our eating disorder. My feeling is a huge unaddressed piece of eating disorder treatment is anger. I think a lot of eating disorder treatment seems to focus on anxiety management and the treatment around anxiety. What I'm seeing is a lot of folks who display higher levels of anxiety. If you strip off the anxiety, one of two things is really going on underneath that. It's either fear or anger. So a lot of people are extremely angry, whether it's about events in their life, whether it's maybe they feel invisible, maybe they've been taken advantage of, maybe there's been unresolved trauma in their lifetime. It could be a multitude of things, but they're very angry, and they've never had an opportunity to really process that anger and get rid of that anger. And so instead, you see it kind of boiling and bubbling and sort of rumbling around inside. And what the eating disorder can do is sort of keep a cement lid on a lot of that anxiety and anger and sadness and things like that. So when we move through the treatment process, what these patients are feeling starts to get more intense because that cement lid is starting to slide off of what was keeping everything kind of contained. So you'll see a lot of rage, profound sadness, loneliness, lots of anxiety, and those feelings kind of have to run their course. We practice a lot of distress tolerance, realizing that you can feel these feelings and sit with them and hold them, and they're not going to hurt you.
Okay.
It's okay.
Yeah.
And we sort of build tolerance to some of these feelings, to where the next time in their life they feel these feelings, they don't have to resort back to a behavior to try to avoid them or make them go away. They've got practice now, and they can handle it, and everything's going okay. So there's a lot of feeling that happens, especially as people start to move away from an eating disorder. The feelings tend to get way more intense.
Yeah, and as you were talking about that, I was thinking, if I were a client and I were in the process of, changing my eating behavior, and these feelings started to emerge, I might feel really scared of those feelings, because these are the feelings that I've either stuffed or I've avoided or just haven't recognized, whatever the case. But they're so intense, like you were talking about, that they could be scary. And I would be tempted to go back to the eating disorder behavior because that's what's comfortable. I don't have to deal with those intense feelings. Let's just go back to where I came from, because it wasn't the greatest thing, but I didn't have to experience these intense feelings.
That's it. That's the nail on the head. And that is it. What you just described is why this process takes a while.
Yeah.
It's why it's no one can, this is how I describe it. Like some of the first sessions I'll have, how long is this going to take? How many sessions do I do? Well, that's adorable. That's not how we work. So it is practice, and it's slow, and we have to ease into things, and the pace is always different for everybody.
Yeah.
So it's not like the lid comes ripping off and all of these feelings explode at once. We sort of gradually move into these and increase the intensity bit by bit by bit as you're increasing your tolerance skills and your adaptation skills. So we're skill building the whole time we're sort of intensifying these emotions. But what you just described is exactly why eating disorder recovery is what I truly believe the hardest thing a person can do. Any kind of addiction recovery is the hardest thing a person can do. It definitely takes a while.
Yeah.
You don't just wake up one day and think, oh my gosh, I'm cured. I don't have an eating disorder anymore. Instead, you're just kind of living your life, and you live your way out of it. And you do wake up one day and you think, I wonder when did I engage in an eating disorder behavior? When was the last time I did it? Oh my God, I can't even remember. Whoa, that's crazy.
Yeah.
It's like that.
Yeah.
It kind of feels like that.
Well, you're starting to get into what I call the recipe for success. And, I often wonder, how is it that people kind of go from point A to point B, where they come in to see you, in your case, with an eating disorder, and then at point B, where what you were just describing, that they can't even remember the last time that was an issue for them. And I kind of wonder what goes on, in between to get them to that point. And I heard you mention the distress tolerance techniques, and that's a very important part of that. What else is a part of that recipe for success, Courtney?
Sure, that's a really great question. There's several important, my feeling is that there are several important fundamental things to provide success for eating disorder treatment. Now, depending on the specific diagnosis, there are different treatment modalities that are more evidence-based to treat that particular disorder. However, I feel things like mindfulness, practice in being present and grounded out here in reality with all of us, instead of sort of being in the past or in the future in your head, is key.
Okay.
That's absolutely crucial. To be able to participate in daily life and really be fully present, meaning your mind's really connected to your body. Everything's sort of lined up in the present day and the present time. That seems to be extremely important. Distress tolerance, learning how to experience kind of intense emotions and not feeling scared or ashamed of them. Okay. But rather understanding it's sort of a normal emotive part of the human experience, and that's kind of part of being a person, and it's totally okay. I would think too, really working on self-compassion. That to me is a fundamental sort of cornerstone for success.
All right.
Anyone suffering from addiction, and definitely anyone suffering from an eating disorder, suffers from so much self-loathing and horrible self-esteem. They're never good enough. Nothing is ever enough. Can always be better, faster, skinnier, prettier, tougher.
Yeah.
They never quite get there. So learning how to sort of tweak your narrative, learning how to speak to yourself with kindness and compassion every single day is crucial, because if you're beating yourself up in your head every day, you're pretty much going to stay stuck in kind of a shame spiral. Yeah. And we won't see a lot of recovery. So I think definitely my big three would be mindfulness, self-compassion, and distress tolerance.
All three of those are evidence-based procedures, so you can see why they would be so effective in helping these people. I wonder, too, if families ever play a role either as part of the counseling process or as part of discussions that go on in counseling sessions.
Yes, absolutely. I always involve the family as much as I can and as much as they will allow. Eating disorders never just affect the individual who is suffering from one. They're systemic, so they affect the whole family. So when I work with adolescents, I find that it's imperative to have family therapy as a part of our individual work. Okay. Mostly because, for instance, if I have a 10th grader or an 11th grader, say this, that comes in for eating disorder treatment, I can scoop her up or him up, and I can do all this great work with them and really turn this eating disorder around. But then when I ditch that eating disorder and I dismiss that client from therapy, they're going to go back into their system. They're going to go back into the same environment. And if the environment hasn't shifted and evolved as well, chances of relapse are pretty high. So what we need to see is the environment and the system in which the patient's a part of also evolve and also become healthier, so that their chances of relapsing are significantly decreased. So I try to involve the family as much as they'll let me, as much as they will participate. Recovery is much, what should I say? Well, it's easier, but I would say it's really important to have a support system. Yes. It's virtually impossible to do this on your own. Right.
So, Courtney, what are some of the challenges in working with these clients? We've talked a little bit about how they might get to a certain point and might, kind of take, two steps forward, one step back, that kind of a thing. But what are some of the challenges that you've found in your work with these clients?
Oh, wow. Lots of challenges. Sometimes they really aren't ready to let it go. Sometimes they have kind of one foot in recovery and one foot in the eating disorder, and they're not quite ready to put both feet in recovery yet. I'd say that's probably the most challenging. Even if they can see the benefit, even if they are able to say verbally, yes, I really want a life without this, but it's just too scary. I can't quite do it. That's probably our biggest challenge. Yeah. Another really big challenge with specific eating disorders is the medical piece of it. Sometimes it feels like a race against the clock, because there has been so much physical damage done to their body that unless recovery happens pretty hot and fast, chances of them ending up hospitalized or permanent damage is pretty high. So there's definitely some pressure around that. I'd say those are probably the biggest ones. Folks who aren't quite ready to change, or probably the medical components were probably the two biggest challenges.
And I think we've all seen pictures of anorexic people, and it's so sad to see that, and to the point of endangering their lives. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about. And I think with the other one, it kind of makes me think about the whole the stages of change, the trans theoretical model, where people aren't always ready to change, even though their family or friends are saying, you've got to do something.
Absolutely.
And you've got to be ready to change, or else it's not going to happen.
That's it. The commitment has to be there, and that motivation. So a lot of folks, when I sort of am introduced to them, a lot of them are kind of in the pre-contemplative phase. So they're we're thinking about it, and we're tossing around options and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So part of some of the initial treatment, part some of my initial sessions, I've got to get them to tell me why they want it and sort of help point out how it's not working for them.
Yeah.
When they say you want ABC out of life, but what this is really doing is giving you X, Y, Z, it doesn't seem to match up. So what do we do about that?
Right.
And are you willing to entertain another way? Are you willing to maybe try something else to get you what you want out of life, which ultimately is like a safety and security?
Yeah, and that's a huge decision, isn't it? Because it kind of goes back to what we were talking about of, basically what you're saying to them is you've got to get to the point where you're going to break up with the girlfriend or boyfriend. That sort of analogy that we were talking about before, that's a huge commitment.
Huge commitment. Yes, huge. And based on the individual's relationship with the eating disorder, there can be a lot of guilt detaching from it. They feel guilty for not doing what you'll hear them say, well, I need to do what it tells me to do, otherwise I feel really guilty.
Right.
So I feel so much shame and guilt for I don't want to let him down. I mean, he's been so helpful, and I love my eating disorder, and I don't want to not do what it says to do because it's my friend.
That's
so
right.
We have to work through the shame and the guilt of being able to think for yourself and kind of being in charge of your own life again. And that can definitely take a minute.
Yeah. Well, Courtney, this last part of the interview is what I refer to as make a mental note. And it's something that you feel is important for the audience to make a mental note of in terms of improving their mental health or their relationships or, whatever the case might be. Do you have any words of wisdom to help an audience member improve their mental wellness or relationships? What do you think?
Absolutely. I'm trying to think what helps me. What I try to remind myself of every day too. First and foremost, I would say try to stay as mindful and as present as you possibly can. And I know just as well as the next American how hard that is.
Yeah.
In our country at this particular point in time. There's a million things that are competing for our attention. But ultimately, I think that if you can be able to dial into you at any given point in the day and just sort of reconnect to you, that seems to really help alleviate a lot of stress and anxiety instead of committing to a fantasy about what may or may not happen in the future. So if you can stay as present as possible, I think that would be extremely helpful. And second, I would absolutely recommend self-compassion. That seems to be something that we lack as a whole. Humanity kind of lacks as a whole. We seem to be very unkind to ourselves. And the kinder we are to ourselves, the kinder we tend to be to others. So I would definitely advocate for self-compassion.
Oh, that's great advice. Well, Courtney, how can a potential client contact you if they're interested in setting up an appointment with you?
Oh, sure. We have a website. It's symmetry-counseling.com, and we're out of Nashville, Tennessee.
Right.
And if anyone listening needs any help in terms of referral sources across the state of Tennessee or really anywhere in the country, if you need help, if you think that you might be suffering from an eating disorder or you know someone who is, you can look us up, the Eating Disorders Coalition of Tennessee, which is edct.net. So either one of those websites, we'll be able to help.
That's great. Well, Courtney, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast today. I'll make sure and put that information about your website and the Eating Disorders Coalition of Tennessee website info in the show notes. So if people want to access that, they can. But I really appreciate you coming on today. This has been quite informative, and I think that people who listen to this appreciate your time in coming on here with us.
Well, it's my honor. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, thanks. All right, that was a great interview with Courtney about eating disorders. And in terms of my mental notes takeaway from today's interview, if people feel like they can control at least one thing, in this case eating, which is, core to people's survival and security needs, then it keeps anxiety at a manageable level. When other things in life feel like they're out of control. And there are similarities between eating disorders and addictions in that there's a compulsion to exhibit a behavior. And so the challenge for a client is to learn how to engage with food and to drain the compulsion of its power so that can occur. So that's my takeaway from today's interview. Now, here's my question. What are some common themes that people with eating disorders discuss in counseling sessions? Well, Courtney mentioned 3 of them: safety, security, and control. A lack of security or safety motivates clients to control things in their lives. Control decreases anxiety that's brought about by insecurity. And, she mentioned that a lot of things that happen in life aren't in a person's control. So the more out of control that people feel, the less safe they feel. And so like I said before, if they feel like they can control at least one thing, the eating, whatever, then it keeps anxiety at a manageable level. So that's good food for thought. Okay, if you'd like the show notes from today's podcast interview, please visit my website, chrisquarto.com, and my last name is Quarto, chrisquarto.com. And as usual, please spread the word about the Make a Mental Note podcast to your friends on Facebook and Twitter. I've had about 2,500 downloads for my podcast interviews so far since September. I'm really excited about that. I can't believe that many people have listened to them, but I'm certainly appreciative of that. But I'd like even more people to hear this. So share the information with your friends, your fellow graduate students, your colleagues, and let them know about this. Have a great rest of the week.